Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
3, Romeo, 2, 2, 4, Yankee, Romeo, Bravo, Delta, Quebec, Oscar, Tango, Papa, 3, Delta, Juliet, Mike, Alpha, Sierra, Victor, Charlie, Kilo, Victor, Charlie, Gold.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of Lux Occult. This is the podcast where we gleefully taunt the mundane, butcher the Latin and most other languages, and we also discuss a variety of occult, esoteric, and adjacent concepts, exploring the intersections of magic, science, art, philosophy, technology, and so much more through the lens of chaos magic. This is occultism for everyone. I'm your host, Lux Estrada, and if you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, that means that this show and magic are for you, if you want them. There are a lot of different ways to be more free in the world, and using magic or making space for a spiritual practice in your life can be one of them. As always, I don't speak for anybody but myself. People can, will, and should disagree sometimes with the things that I or my guests say on this show. How we ever learn anything if we were all in agreement on all things at all times after all? And like those who attempt to be reasonable should always be willing to do, I can and often will revise my opinions or thoughts about things based on new evidence. Very excited to share the amazing conversations I had with two groups of magical practitioners I've impaneled to share thoughts about navigating issues related to mental health in one's magical practice. We get into a lot of great stuff, and there are a ton of helpful perspectives and some great sort of life hacks as well. We're going to be starting out with Adsi Ipsa, Charlie, and Liliana for the first panel discussion, and then we're going to hear from Catalyst, Hotwing Hermit, Damien, and Barracutie. Thanks so much to everybody who joined me for this awesome conversation. Although magic is incredible and can be super helpful, there are also some risks involved with practicing it. And what we're hoping to present to you all here today are some tools and experiences that we've found personally helpful in navigating and managing those risks. So lots of awesome stuff to get into. If you like the show and the other work that I've got going on, you can support it on Patreon. If you do so, you can take a bibliomancy break with me. There are no tiers or levels or whatever, so give as you will. Buy me a coffee is an option for those who wish to show their support with a one-time donation, although it tells me that it is now offering a monthly option as well, so that's cool. Thank you so much to everybody who is supporting the show. It makes it possible by allowing me to cover the expenses associated with making it, which, as expenses are wont to do, continually seem to like to rise. The support is especially helpful as demands for my time and energy increase due to some life circumstances and new developments, cool stuff going on. I really appreciate the opportunity to be making this thing and having the resources necessary to reach you all today. Many thanks to the support which is making this possible. Although I'm a pretty introverted person and I don't use social media very much due to this, I'm not there checking on stuff every day or anything like that, but that certainly doesn't mean that I don't want to hear from you all or anything. I'm beyond lucky to have such amazing listeners, collaborators, cohorts, co-conspirators, etc. I always welcome people's thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, or arcane revolutions. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com. For the time being, you can find me on Instagram at luxoccultpod or on Blue Sky at luxastrata, Luxastrata. Alright, lots of awesome stuff to get into here today. I'll be back after this first conversation to introduce the next panel, but without further ado, let's dive into my chat with Ipsa, Charlie, and Liliana. Alright, well, welcome to this special edition of the Lux Occult podcast. This is part 2 of our conversation about magic and mental health. The topic of magical thinking is pretty much what we're focusing on for this panel discussion and the one that we recorded previously. Tonight I've got some awesome folks joining me. I've got Adsi Ipsa, I've got Charlie, and I've got Liliana here, and we're going to be talking about the same questions that I asked the panel for the last recording. How do you know when you're getting into potential trouble by going, quote, too far in your practice, or do you not consider this to be a risk? What have you done in the past to get yourself out of potential trouble if you've had that experience? Banishing rituals and things like that are classic examples of rituals that can be performed to go from one mental space to another, but I'm curious about the ideas and philosophies y'all might have when it comes to how to use these tools when, etc. And also, whatever you think might be helpful for the listeners and I to hear is, of course, welcome as well. So, having rolled initiative for us, we have Adsi Ipsa up first to share.
Hello. My name is Adse Ipsa, or just Ipsa, and I was excited to join because I have OCD, and OCD is the your brain is too good at magical thinking disease. And so on the sort of surface, it doesn't mix well with having an active magical practice. I've been practicing for about 5 years, but before that, I've always been religious, and this has integrating spiritual practice with my brain has always been a challenge. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. For me, I think one of the things that I like to think about when going into something like magic is the idea that magic is not a safe practice. It is not completely free from the risk of harm. And I think that a way to illustrate this is by talking about meditation, largely because meditation is something that is basically universally recommended by magical practitioners and has been for quite a long time, and also has the scientific medical establishment on its side too, and which is kind of rare to see that, as this is like a universally good practice. And when you actually dig into it, I do think most people's lives would be improved by meditating 10 minutes a day or something, but meditation actually is not a risk-free practice. As a very simple example, people who meditate more than 30 minutes a day, studies have shown that they think they sleep better, but they actually sleep worse, objectively speaking. And when you start to meditate for hours, especially like in a retreat, meditative states, and you see this in old meditation manuals, and you see this in the experiences of people today too, can lead you into places that look a lot like depression, look a lot like anxiety, look a lot like mania, and sometimes in rare cases look like psychosis. And I can send some links for after the show about articles, and Harper's has done a good article, Retreats Gone Bad, for example. But one thing you see in these retreats where these happen, there's a lot of things that are contributing to why these retreats give you an altered state of mind. You eat less, you are sleeping a lot less, and you're not talking to anybody. You're not even really allowed to journal. You're not, in some retreats, you're not allowed to pray if that's a thing that's important to you. And so you're basically cut off from your normal network. And there's reasons for this. But something that has always really stuck out to me is that for a lot of meditation retreats, if you leave the retreat halfway through, you're not allowed to come back. You're not allowed to come back to that retreat or to anything they ever put on, ever. There's a lot of social pressure to keep going. And so it usually doesn't go badly, but when things start to go badly, it makes it very hard to know I have to leave this right now. And so something that is, I think, important if you have a pre-existing mental health condition is you need to know ahead of time that you have a way out. It might not be a good idea to ramp up practice from I'm meditating 10 minutes a day to I'm going to a retreat and doing 12-hour sessions. It might be okay for other people, but there is more of a risk there. And that one way to manage that risk is by taking things slowly. I think there's things to be aware of, too, with the way that a lot of people talk about magic as being a process of self-discipline. If you look at an Abramelin practice or something, a lot of times that involves fasting, eating less, or keeping silence about what's going on in your practice, or waking up early. All these things that can contribute to the same sort of buildup of things that will facilitate a powerful change in consciousness, but could also make your brain break if it goes wrong. And so being very careful about doing these things and maybe trying alternate practices instead. I think something that also really stands out to me is the way that belief plays a role in this. I know that when I was operating in ecstatic Christian spaces as a teen, one of the issues is that doubt is not just that people want you to believe in God, but that doubt is sort of seen as itself dangerous and sinful. And so when you start to have these doubts of, I'm not sure that this practice is good for me, it can lead to a place where you're not really looking at the warning signs that you're normally looking at. And belief can be a prison that keeps you doing something that might not be a good idea. And I think a lot of times magicians think that we don't carry these things over from Christianity, but it is sort of the general culture in America. And so it does bubble in, and you can see it in thoughts like, your magic isn't going to work if you don't believe in it hard enough. Or that sort of new thought that thoughts are causative. And if you take that seriously enough, that can really mess with your mind a lot. And you can also sort of see it in practices where it's well, if I don't believe that these spirits are literally real, maybe they're going to get insulted. And so it pushes you into a certain overly literal model where you can think that the spirits or the gods are out to get you. And that can lead to a lot of issues. And so I think like if there was one thing I wanted people to take is like make sure you always have a way out and maybe just take your magic about like 20% less seriously. I think there's a cartomancer, like a person who reads playing cards in somewhere in the Boston area, and she has a self-published book. And I remember reading the intro to it. And this is a person who, by all accounts, probably believes in magic more than any of us because it's what like she does with her entire life professionally. And yet she says something like, I only think about 80% of what I predict in readings actually is true. And I think that having that freedom there, you could like look at that cynically and say, well, that's just a way to like sneak confirmation bias in. And that's a fair criticism. But also it does do a lot to like, if you are sort of so totalizing with your magical beliefs that you have to make everything fit, it can really lead you to some more dangerous places.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you brought up meditation. That was a really important and poignant point that you made and a really helpful one. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So next up we have Charlie.
Oh, hi. So, hi, I'm Charlie. I'm they, them. I work a lot with like the energy model and also the psychology model, and that's very important to all of this part. A big part of like my practice is preventative care for like trying to make sure I don't get in too deep because what I'm working with is like CPTSD and a lot of OCD tendencies. It's not formally diagnosed, but looking at my brain patterns and my family history, I think we've all got it. So in order to try and make sure that I'm actually like making sure that I keep myself safe, I have pretty strict boundaries about like when I'm going to practice magic. Basically, like the one main tie-in is like I will light a candle and that's when magic starts. And when the candle's blown out, that's when magic ends. So I don't keep like the obsessive thoughts with me going forward as much. I leave it in that space, and if it's going to work, it does, and if it's not going to, then it doesn't, and I'm not worrying about it, and I'm not fixating on it. But, on the off chance I do end up with kind of magical thinking, which definitely tends to happen, and definitely when I'm a little more stressed out about certain things, I kind of have a little flowchart of questions I'll ask myself when I'm finding that I'm slipping into things, and it's like I don't have hard, fast questions, but it's along the lines of like, is this a coincidence? Because, it's always good to check in again with the psychology model. So yeah, is it a coincidence? Could this just be a coincidence? Is believing in magic helping me right now or harming me? That's really the main two is like, can it be explained by something else? And is it helping me currently? Because, there's been definitely times where I come from a place of like desperation with my practice where I'm like, oh, I need to do these banishings. I need to protect myself. And usually that's when I start taking a step back. It's like, this is no longer helpful for me. So maybe I need to like work on something else. And the psychology model part of it is when I'm finding that I'm, kind of slipping with those things, like not being able to necessarily believe that things could be a coincidence and stuff, I slide back into like trying to take bare bones of like, okay, this is just a tool I'm using for my brain. Is it currently helping me? Is it currently harming me? Am I detaching from reality in ways that are harmful to me or other people potentially? It doesn't get that drastic necessarily, but it's always something good to like check in with.
Yeah, right on. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. And yeah, lots of good and helpful things in there. I appreciate it. Liliana is up next here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Liliana, she, her. I signed up for this because I am a new witch. Like I'm rounding out my second year of practice, and I just thought it would be neat to come and participate and learn and everything. But I would say I definitely believe in, going too far. I don't think I've ever gotten there myself. I'm a Hecatan magician. I work with Hecate in a sort of weird simulation, deific, psychological model. I work in STEM, so I've had to do a lot of negotiation with myself in terms of not really so much as justifying, but, rationalizing and fitting what magic is into my larger I guess, worldview. And I guess it depends on really what one means when we say too far. But like getting like really deep, too deep into magical thinking, I believe that when you're externalizing your power, that is when you run into trouble, really. If you're putting your power into something else, someone else, something else, it limits your own potential and vision. And that's sort of what I think of when I think of going too far.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And thank you for being willing to join us even though you're, still sort of new on the path and everything. I think it is really cool and important to have perspectives from people who are at different points and different journeys and different ways of being in the world and all the rest of it. So thank you so much for being willing to join us. I wanted to mention that I'm excited to run the Hecatian ceremony that you and I are going to be hosting here locally soon. So just remembered about that. But yeah, I'm really excited about that. And there was something that came up on the chat that I was hoping we could get into. Charlie, you had mentioned that there was a kind of distinction that you like to draw in your head between magical thinking and magical thinking with a K. And I was hoping we might be able to explore that a little bit if you're willing.
Yeah, totally. Let's go for it. What do you want to talk about with regards to it?
Oh, I was just hoping you might be able to break down that sort of definition for us. Like, what is the difference between these two things as you sort of think about them and understand them?
Well, again, like psychology model, I'm willing to acknowledge like they could be the same thing. There could be some overlap. But essentially, like magical, I'm thinking is like maladaptive, kind of harming my everyday life sort of things, like fixations and ruminations that kind of get in the way of me like living my life. That could be mundane, they could be pertaining to magical stuff. Usually it's more just like a fixation. And magical is like, looking for correlation and causation with regards to magic and like things that I would say are like directly related to like a ritual or a working or something. And it gets kind of murky too if you end up having like, like ritual, like quote unquote, like actually like I need to like, flip light switches or something, but that's why I have so many boundaries around like if it happens during the candle, then yes. But if it's just, I thought too hard about something and made it happen, it's like, well, that's not a ritual space thing. I don't control the universe like that. And I start like interrogating it with like CBT kind of techniques.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, not the
Yes.
fun kind of CBT.
Yeah, I was just going to say that too.
Sorry. But yes, fuck yeah.
Yeah, I always clarify for people that too. Not the fun one. Just the useful one.
Yes, and it is very useful. And I suppose therapy can be fun sometimes. So perhaps it's not always unfun. Yeah, I appreciate that. Liliana, I'm so glad that you mentioned being in STEM and that being something that you're kind of having to sort of negotiate in terms of approaching a spiritual practice, because this was something that I really liked about chaos magic when I first encountered it. Back in the day, I'm like, oh shit, this is a system that doesn't ask me to necessarily believe in the things that I, as a person who was also, a STEM person at the time, like it was hard for me to sort of go to that territory. And especially because of some things about my background and stuff, it felt a little bit unsafe to kind of go into that spirit model territories and things like that. So having that psychology model be a part of it was something that really allowed me to have like an accessible on-ramp into like some of the things I ended up getting into and everything. And recently I've noticed that in some circles, ours included, I've noticed a little bit of disparagement being cast on the psychology model. Some people have said that it's like edgelordy or whatever. And I think that that's fair. There can definitely be some manifestations of it that feel that way. But I also think that it can be something that makes the practice much more accessible to certain types of people. And I don't think we should throw it out just because it doesn't. The spirit model is very, very, very popular right now, and for good reason and everything. This is an old way of doing things and the original way of doing things, perhaps. But I think that having the different models of magic is really cool, and I love that we're able to sort of look at things through these different lenses without having to actually like agree on what the quote truth is. Right? Just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Yeah. Gosh, I I'll always be a proponent of psychology and doubt. Because ultimately, to me, magic is unknown and to a degree unknowable. Like when we act, Charlie was saying that they only count things that happen in their ritual space. Like I sort of don't bother attributing outcomes of things that happen to magic. Most of my work involves shedding from me, that which is no longer useful, or bolstering myself to go out and, accomplish what I'm doing rather than, I guess, manipulate something else from afar. It's sort of one of those things where I just limit my own work to things that I think I can affect.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you feel about the ceremony that we'll be performing, because there is a little bit of an
Well-
aspect of, having an outside effect of ourselves, perhaps. Hard to say.
Well, yeah, I think what like the working we'll be doing on Saturday like falls within that. But like, as to like how well it accomplishes, how well our donations protect and guide those that they reach,
There'll be no way for us to tell. Yeah.
we'll have no knowledge of.
Yeah,
And
for
so
sure.
like I do my best to find the satisfaction in knowing that I've done all that I can.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think that I sort of have a similar space with it as well. I think that it can be a dangerous and unhelpful road to go down to ascribe things outside of ourselves. As we've been discussing tonight, that's a big part of the dangerous type of magical thinking. I'm curious, for the people that struggle with compulsiveness or obsessiveness, things like along those lines, is there a certain thing that you start to notice within your practice, like where you know that it's time to kind of like back off and slow down? Is there a certain pattern that you've identified? You don't have to share like details or anything like that if it's too personal, but if there's something that could be helpful in terms of, if somebody else might be experiencing that as a sort of like red flag or an orange flag or yellow flag or whatever color flag might signal caution. I'm curious if there's anything that comes up there for anybody.
Yeah. So I will say that like the white whale of my practice is, I think, knowing whether there's anything on the other line. I don't actually do a lot of operative magic because I am in a position in my life where I have a lot of mundane means to accomplish the things that I'd like to do. And so a lot of it is just a spiritual practice. But I am like a practicing pagan, and I have over time started to use pendulum divination as a method of contacting the non-human persons who are important to me. And I mean, so like pendulum dowsing is, for those who don't know, it's having something on a string and seeing the way it moves. And if it moves one direction, that means yes, and another direction, it means no. And you can have a conversation through this by playing a game of 20 questions. Now, the thing is we know on a physics level that why does the pendulum move? It's because your hand is moving. So in a way that's like maybe even more uncomfortable than just sort of putting your interpretations on tarot cards, which have like some base element of physical randomness in there. There's a very like real danger of, okay, when I'm having this practice and I believe that there's people on the other end, am I speaking to them or am I speaking for them? Am I like putting words in their mouth and having them say things that I just want to hear?
Mm.
And this can be a very upsetting thing to me because it's an ethical problem, and it's something it's something I take seriously and I worry a lot about. But I also know that in my own life that wanting to hear the voice of the Christian God, like if you want that hard enough, you will eventually hear a voice, and it's not going to be a good voice. And that this desire for objectivity is something that can be quite dangerous because it's just not possible. There isn't actually like a particular methodology where you can be absolutely 100% certain that what you're getting is the unmediated discourse of like some other spirit. There's always going to be at least a layer of human interpretation on it, or sometimes just this doesn't work. And I think the thing I brought up earlier about maybe your divinations are only 80% correct, a thing that has very much helped me. So one thing is I take stock of, am I doing divination too much is one of the questions. And then two is, when I am doing it, am I getting too stressed about it? If I am doing it too much and getting too stressed about it, I will just put it to the side and not do it. But one of the sort of mental medicines around this is just saying, any given conversation has about a 75% chance of being accurate. And so if I do get garbage one day, I don't need to like stress out about the entire system is collapsing and I've been making stuff up this entire time and I've actually been crazy and everything is wrong. Instead, I can just sort of focus on, did the advice I just received, was it reasonable? Does it fit in with what a caring friend might tell me? And that's maybe just enough. But yeah, I think that's kind of what I was getting at with like why the way you think about these things can be so important to managing obsessions.
Yeah, thank you. The divination thing makes a lot of sense. That is definitely one of my tells as well. Thank you. Does anybody else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, first off, that's a big part of why I don't do a lot of divination. So that's like a good way to think about it that I haven't necessarily really thought of before. So thank you. Is yeah, usually with divination, to like add to that, that's another one where, like, for example, if there was one time where I had this strong impulse to go look at my tarot deck, and I did one card pull and it was the Tower. And I was like, oh no, my life is over. But so, in moments like that, and because this is where stuff starts to leak over, is like, oh, I'm just worrying about it in my day to day. If I'm not careful, like I'll just walk around going, where's the tower? Where's the tower? And like that's not helpful, right? So a thing I like to do with tarot specifically is like think of it as self-reflection. Like, what am I projecting onto them? What am I interpreting? Why am I interpreting it this way? So, it doesn't necessarily need to be someone on the other line. It could be like, okay, well, what am I getting from my own subconscious?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think I kind of tend to think of it similarly in terms of like accessing a part of myself that might be able to see a little bit more of the picture, perhaps. But I mean, no form of communication is perfect either. There's always a signal to noise ratio, right? And so there's always going to be noise along with any signal. I think that's also good to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's very true.
I just recently started doing divination again. I kind of got like into it when I first started my practice, doing like daily tarot readings for myself. And then like I almost like became like fearful of asking questions, of like knowing, because I just didn't, just doing it like too often, like left me with inventing questions, I guess. So it became almost a thing where like I set it aside for a while because I just I didn't want to know. I wanted to deal with things as they came. And I was just getting readings that I just either didn't remember or couldn't tell you like what I've got now. But I'm just, I'm starting to use it a little bit again, more as Charlie described, as, kind of reflecting, myself and what I'm putting into things and that sort of thing. But yeah.
Yeah, right on. Thank you. Yeah, I think there is this sort of danger of the self-fulfilling prophecy that can come up with any divinatory practice that, and as people were mentioning, like this sort of way that it is possible to have your own projections be put onto something. And I think tarot is a great place to actually sort of like, as Charlie kind of described it, interrogate it in that context, right? Like if these are these projections that I'm putting, what does that mean? Like, so therefore what, right? That's still an interesting thing to interrogate, even if it's not supernatural, right? So since we have a little bit of extra time here, I'm curious if you had a young magician who is, or Wiccan or whatever, magical practitioner approach you who is very new to the path, what do you think would be the things that you would be most likely to want to warn this person about pitfalls they might want to avoid? I think for me, one of the things that I would point out to people would be that there's a long kind of lineage in some types of magical systems and stuff of like a lot of historical narratives like of imperialism and things like that present in it. So I think it's kind of important to like look at a lot of the material from that context and understand that about it so that we don't unintentionally bring those things that we might not want into our own practices. Like the idea of leaving what doesn't work in the past and taking what does work but also being really discerning about the context in which we find that information and all that stuff is definitely one thing that's been on my mind recently.
I actually do know a lot of like fairly fledgling chaos magicians in the meat space, so I'm trying to think of like advice I've given them and stuff too. I mean, the main thing I would say that like actually got me into magic is like you don't have to do everything the same way everyone else does, is really what set me free with it. It's like your practice can be based on things that speak to you and feel good to you. They don't have to be all like high ritual ceremonial. You don't need to have like the perfect tools crafted under like the right astrological signs. You really can just use like post-it notes and whatever you have at your disposal and whatever flavor you want to in order to like get results and actually start up doing things.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the class of question that I am asked most often by listeners and others is, am I doing this right? And there's a lot of concern for like, am I actually accomplishing this in the sort of like way that they imagine it's been standardized, and like really kind of moving away from that thinking is I think one of the first hurdles that a lot of people find on their magical paths.
If I could go back in time and tell myself, like give myself advice, it's that there are a lot of different ways of doing magic in the same way that there are a lot of different instruments with which you can play music. And while a competent musician can probably play several instruments, you don't become a great musician by learning to play literally every single instrument. You usually learn to become a good musician and an effective musician by learning how to play one instrument really well and then bringing that to other new situations with a different instrument or something like that. Because I just remember I spent so much money on books or collecting tarot decks or things like that, where it just became a lot of physical stuff that had no purpose. We live in a culture that is constantly telling you to buy more things. And it's really important to, I think, have somebody from the outset to like remind you, hey, you can't actually buy a depth of practice. You really just have to like, just pick one thing, like just buy 6 ways and just use that and nothing else or something like that. And it might be worth going through a stage of experimenting with a couple different things to figure out where you want to like dig into. But I think just having some sort of counterbalance to the way that like capitalism has really created mass market occultism and trying to like resist that would be important.
Yeah, that's a great point. There is always the pressure or just the temptation to always want to buy the next tarot deck or whatever it is. And yes, you can't really buy magic because it's free. So yeah, fuck yeah. I'm curious if any of you here have had experiences where you've had a friend or an acquaintance go down a bad road with their magical path, and the ways that they either were or were not able to recover from that situation. Is that something that have you been able to learn anything from watching other people's experiences?
This was a good long time ago now, and it may not have been strictly magic's fault. But my ex-roommate was really, really by the book pagan, and everything had to be just so. And everything had to be like very expensive and and like they started a coven and stuff, and I feel like all of these practices kind of gave them like it bolstered maybe an already blooming superiority complex that may not have necessarily aided them in their mental health journey,
Hmm.
which, if that's kind of like my main goal with most of my magic is to try and bolster my mental health personally. So, and I feel like that's not an uncommon experience where like if you feel like you've got the power of the universe in some capacity, that you kind of start floating away with it. So,
Yeah, I definitely do think that this is like a pitfall to avoid for a lot of people. Like, even if you're just using magic to address self-esteem or mental health issues or whatever, like you're still, I think, through those practices going to be healing yourself and going to be sort of gaining personal power through that healing. And power always has a sort of, there's a dance that is done there. Like, they say that power corrupts, right? And I think that part of the magical practice has to do with like learning to dance with that power in a way that's not going to be corruptive. Otherwise, you're not able to sort of like hold on to it. I think that that's kind of the test of it is, will it corrupt you and you will lose it perhaps, or will you be able to handle it and will you be able to proceed forward? But maybe that's just me. I'm not sure. I can only speak from my own experiences. But yes, that sounds familiar. And I know that people have talked about the term Magusitis comes up. I think this is in Phil Hines' Condensed Chaos, where I believe this is where this originates. I could be wrong, but like the idea that there can be the situations where it kind of goes to your head in a way that causes you to sort of like lose touch with reality, at least, in some observing some people that have kind of gone down this road. And yeah, there's a sort of like mania that can be associated with it, and it can also cause people to become impulsive and sometimes unsafe.
Yeah, so this is not a close friend, but I was involved in a magical group once that I decided to leave because I had sort of watched the founder start to speak on a number of things that weren't necessarily magical. And I think like sort of from the outside you can see that like it's sort of there's like two things going on. One is that like being good at believing really unconventional things can maybe change your filter about what you're willing to believe about everything else. But also I think the sort of way that magic is a spiritual practice and it like integrates your entire life might make you think that your magical expertise can sort of go over into other areas where you don't actually have real expertise in. And that can be like very dangerous. It can be very painful to like watch somebody go through that because you care about human being and like because you can like start to hurt people as you do that. And you can start to hurt yourself as well. And so just like I think not only just magitis as like a way of getting too sure of your own magical power, but like also being aware of sometimes that can even expand into areas outside of magic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I definitely have seen that attitude among magicians, and I do think it's important that like magic is an awesome skill. It's a skill that you can apply to accessing whatever you sort of want in your life, but it doesn't necessarily like just because you're great at magic doesn't mean that you can like bake an apple pie from scratch. Like that's a different fucking thing. So yeah.
I tend to think of magic more as like a psychological tool to use alongside therapy and like good therapy practices and good mental health practices. Personally, like a lot of my stuff is around managing symptoms and like managing, like, as much as we're talking a lot about how it can harm you in certain ways today, it's also like incredibly useful for managing mental health. On the flip side of all the things I've said about like rumination and stuff, it's also been, I used to do this ritual where I would take everything I've been ruminating about that's like really bothering me and I'd write it down and I'd burn it. And then, ritually burn it and maybe throw salt on it, whatever I was feeling at the time. And then it like legitimately the next day it would be like, oh, like I would feel the spiral start to happen and then it's like, oh no, we can't worry about that anymore. We burned it. So like the two kind of complement each other really well if you let them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. This came up in the last conversation, the difference between things which are pathological and things which are pathologized. And I think that that's a kind of a touchstone there for sure. And we talked about this a little bit before tonight, but like, is this helping me? Is this helping my life? Is it making it better? Is it fucking me up? Or is it hurting myself? Is it hurting other people potentially? Like that being the touchstone for what is actually pathological, regardless of what might be pathologized by our culture. Does anybody have any thoughts about the relationship between what's pathologized and what's pathological?
I'm not 1,000% sure I know the distinction between the two. Can I get a
Oh yeah,
definition?
thank you. Yeah, no, thank you so much. So I would define like like something that's pathological, something that is like the word root comes from pathos, right? Like pain, that sort of like it's causing pain, it's causing harm of some kind, or it's deleterious to the organism in some way if it's like a disease or whatever. Something which is pathologized is something which is put into that category by whatever establishment might make the rules. Like, so magical thinking is pathologized by the psychiatric community in terms of it being associated with things like obsessive compulsive disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, other things like that. But it's not always pathological because it's not always harmful. And as we've established tonight, sometimes it can be a really helpful thing, but it's all about being discerning and understanding that nuance.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I don't know if I have like any deep insights or anything, but I do
Oh.
find it very interesting how we can weaponize the idea of like pathological, like people can impose, oh, this is a pathological thing onto things that they don't like.
Mhm.
It's just kind of fascinating. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there can be places where this is something that is used as like a means of controlling other people and other things like that. And I think, yeah, I think it's really important for us to interrogate that for ourselves because a lot of what we do in a magical practice might be pathologized, might be taboo, depending on, what lens we're looking through. And so kind of like finding that ground for yourself where you are the authority in your magical practice, but also having you be a safe leader for yourself by checking in with others and doing the types of reality testing stuff that we've been discussing tonight, I think is that to me is sort of walking that tightrope.
I think I would find it really hard to like draw a boundary between like, well, what are things that are merely pathologized versus pathological? Because like at the end of the day, we do kind of want to integrate ourselves into a society, and that's part of what being a healthy human being is. And there's like no perfect society too. So it's like a very hard line to draw. But that said, I think something somebody said to me early on that was very helpful was if you ever actually interact with somebody who is undergoing a psychotic break, the difference between somebody who is maybe believes something magical about the world and somebody who is really having a psychotic break is that the person who is psychotic often doesn't know that you don't see the things that they're saying. And so one of the things that's really important for keeping track of is this thing pathological is figuring out, can I still distinguish between things that are, I don't love this language, but things that are true for me and things that are true for everybody else. Because as long as you can continue to make that distinction, you can continue to integrate yourself into a society of other human beings, which you need to do to survive. And when you start to lose that, and you might not even notice when you're starting to lose that, but that is noticing that your ability to still do that, it's kind of like the pinching yourself to know that you're not dreaming, is helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think that's a really important point. The idea of consensus reality has kind of come up here as a touchstone. Like, are you sort of in the same reality that everybody else is agreeing is the reality, or are you stepping into a different version of it for yourself that nobody else is in but you, and making that distinction? Yeah, thank you. Well, I really appreciate everybody taking the time to hang out and everything tonight. We still have plenty of time if people would like to share more thoughts or respond to anything that's been said, or if anybody has anything that they're excited about that they would like to share with the listeners and I, there's an opportunity to plug things. We could start with Adsi Ipsa, since that is our initiative order.
I would like to plug logging off and not watching the news. I think it's great. You should do it. Delete your social media accounts. Maybe if you want something very practical, maybe stop using Gmail and use something more private so that people aren't making money to sell ads based on your private correspondence. But yeah, nothing else to plug in particular.
Fuck yeah, I love it. Thank you. Charlie.
Okay, so I'm in a band called It Cometh. We've got a band camp. It's basically a hyper sigil, all the music that we do. So if you're into, chaos fun time, go check that out. Also, I'm a tattoo artist, and you can hit me up on Charlie Horse Tattoo if you're in the neighborhood or whatever.
Fuck yeah, dude, I'm here for it. So I can't let you go without interrogating this hyper sigil band thing a little bit more. I know people will be mad at me if I don't. So could you elaborate on that a little bit, please, if you're willing?
Okay, if I can do the elevator pitch version. We have this egregore that I created for the band called Balsamus. I kind of just opened the door one day and let this thing through. I didn't make up the name, otherwise I would have made it not so close to balsamic vinegar. But there's a lot of jokes. Anyway, so Like, the whole idea I had for it was if we have this thing and we treat it real and we like shout it out, it shows, can we create a god? And it's had like a lot of very interesting effects that are just, fun to watch. It was just kind of a fun thought experiment. And right now we're working on a concept album that's basically a astral temple dedicated to Balsamus that's supposed to power it more just to see what it'll do for us. It's really all just kind of interesting. And it's like fun metal music, so
I fucking love it, dude. Not only the cool metal, but also the fun magical experiment. And I'm curious, what type of domain is the god Balsamus going to sort of inhabit?
I mean, when I first got the name, obviously I looked it up because I was like, is that a thing? And not a lot came up originally. It was weirdly enough on some random obscure like apocryphal text. It like mentioned something named Balsamus, like talking to Adam in the Garden of Eden and basically being like, I'm the coolest, and then it just left. So that's why it got edited out. I've had a lot of people that I've actually talked to about this also. We broke down like the name potentially as like Baal used to be like Lord in like I think it was Mesopotamian culture pantheon. I'm probably screwing it up. But so Baal or Bel was like Lord of, so and that's where we get the Lord Baal, like the demon from Goetia from. So it could be Baal Samos as in like the same as Baal, or I don't know. It's kind of interesting to just kind of think about. But the thing that kind of stuck out for me with that was Baal also one of their offices is like being popular, and that was like one of the things that Balsamus is supposed to do is make the band popular. So it was kind of an interesting synchronicity there.
I love it. Fuck yeah. Well, that's very exciting. We'll definitely put a link to your Bandcamp in the show notes here.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Liliana, do you have anything that you're excited about that you would like to plug?
I have absolutely nothing to plug.
That is totally chill. No
I
worries.
got nothing.
That's all good. All right. Well, I really appreciate y'all spending the time tonight and really appreciated hearing all of these awesome perspectives, and there's a lot of really helpful kind of hit tidbits and like hacks and other things in here tonight as well. So I really, really appreciate people's generosity and sharing all of this with the listeners. And I will open up the floor now to any last thoughts or words of advice you would like leave the listeners and I with.
Be excellent to each other and party on.
3, Romeo, 2, 2, 4, Yankee, Romeo, 7, Bravo, Delta, Quebec.
Greetings, it is I, Luxa from the future. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that you are enjoying the episode so far. I really loved that first panel discussion. Thanks so much to Ipsa, Charlie, and Liliana for all the awesome perspectives and information that they shared. I was really impressed by both groups that I talked to for today's special bonus episode. Hail Balsamus! Before we get into the next discussion, I just wanted to mention some context so that people aren't lost. In the next chat you will hear with Catalyst, Hotwing Hermit, Damien, and Barracutie, which is actually the first one we recorded, in case it's confusing. Both of the panels are on this episode. It's the whole kit and caboodle of what we've recorded on this topic so far. In this one, though, Damien is going to talk a bit about something called corridor work, which is a technique in Weaving Fate by Aidan Wachter. Aidan explains in the book that it's similar to some types of techniques that are used in some therapeutic modalities. I've actually been instructed by therapists to do kind of similar types of things with corridor work as part of like doing trauma therapy stuff. It can be really cool and really helpful stuff. It's kind of about visiting older versions of yourself, which are also younger versions of yourself, and communicating with them, offering them help, reconciling things, and other things like that. I'll talk a little bit more about the old, young parts of ourselves later on after the next panel discussion. This one is longer than the one that you just heard since there's more people and since that was just kind of the vibe that night. So we're going to take a little break about halfway through, and I'll play a little spot for the Discord server that we hang out on and do a quick blurb for the Green Mushroom Project. There's lots of great stuff to get into here, so let's go ahead and proceed on to our next panel discussion about magic, mental health, and magical thinking. with Catalyst, Hotwing Hermit, Damien, and Barracutie. Cheers. All right, well, welcome to this special edition of the Lux Occult podcast. I'm here with my first panel to discuss a topic that is, I think, a really important and interesting one, and one that I don't hear discussed too often in a lot of magical spaces, at least not very publicly. And this has to do with the idea of magic and mental health. We're going to be getting into some kind of specific topics surrounding how we navigate things in our practices and some of our own sort of personal philosophies. I do want to give people the context that none of us are speaking from the standpoint of professional mental health experts or anything like that. We're very much practitioners who are speaking from our own experiences about our own life. So please take that into account when you are listening to our conversation today. Well, I've got an awesome team of folks here to share their thoughts. Catalyst, would you like to please go ahead and go first and introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Hello. I go by Catalyst on the Green Machine server that we have. Been studying the occult for about 25 years. I've been studying religion and spirituality in general, pretty much for as long as I can recall. Since childhood, I was raised in a very, very strict, somewhat fundamentalist Christian home. And when I escaped that particular organization, I guess, I really went on a bit of a spree and a bender, trying to explore all of the different paths out there in the world to understand both the nature of the mind and reality a little better. I also used a fair number of entheogens, various substances, again, a lot of experimentation, because I really wanted to understand where the boundary was, or if there was a boundary between my conscious mind, my subconscious mind, and the world, this external experience that we all share to some degree. So yeah, that's been my sort of ongoing journey, essentially. It started out as I was trying to become an enlightened human being and understand the mysteries of the universe. And now I'm doing my best to being a reasonably good and supportive and loving human being, and still working on those mysteries.
All right, fuck yeah, thank you. Well, next up, we've got Mike, aka Hotwing Hermit.
Yeah, hey, I'm Mike. I go by Hotwing Hermit on Green Machine. And yeah, I've been practicing probably since like my late teens, early 20s in some capacity, but only really kind of got like regular and routine with what I was doing, like maybe later into my 20s. But a lot of the approach that I take, like years ago, there was this term that was going around called chaonism, which is kind of like a combination of chaos magic and animism. And I'm just like, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's definitely my jam. I don't know if I would reduce myself to like one label, but that one's pretty close. But a lot of actually what I do is specifically drawing from like a really eclectic blend of a lot of things, some natural magic, some things that are specifically oriented around my Catholic background, having grown up in the church and everything like that, and actually kind of using that in a way to process some of the stuff that is obviously very complicated when it comes to like, that particular thing. But in practice, a lot of it ends up looking like, just very regular, like meditation, prayer, like devotion to various different allies that I work with, like very simple stuff. Art is a huge part of what I do, specifically writing. And yeah, that's basically what I got.
All right, fuck yeah. Yeah, the chaonism thing makes a lot of sense why you found your way to us. Very cool. Well, next up, we've got Damien, sorry.
Okay, what to say about me? I'm Damien. I go by Frater Damiana in the Green Machine server, and I have been practicing magic for probably over 25 years now as well. I found my first magic book in a used bookstore when I was about 8 years old, and self-initiated into a Wiccan paradigm when I was 11. I was raised in a household with an agnostic father and an excommunicated Catholic mother. So they were both very vocal advocates of questioning doctrine, and if I didn't like the religion that we had at home, that I was free to, go and find, other ways of being, I guess. And it took my mom a while to come around to witchcraft, but she also now identifies herself as a kitchen witch, actually, which is kind of cool. But that was sort of what started my foray into reading different theologies and mythologies of a bunch of different cultures and stuff like that. And just sort of wondering about religion and spirituality from a very young age. And I've been practicing within the chaos magic sphere now for probably about 6 years, I want to say. Chaos magic sort of tickles that wonder that I had when I was a kid with the paradigm jumping and getting to learn so much about the way magic is practiced by so many different people. Mental health wise, I am neurodivergent and mentally ill myself. I also have a background in harm reduction and specifically around substance use education with my own brain squirrels, as I call them, and just my body chemistry. I was unable to find a psychiatric medication that worked for me, and throughout my teens and 20s, I was self-medicating with basically anything I could find, really. And through my own sort of battles with my own addictions and having to find a version of recovery that worked for me that was non-abstinence based and allowed me to explore entheogens from a therapeutic standpoint has been sort of a core point of my practice, and just learning more about myself through exploration of my own psyche, I suppose, and hopefully then being able to take that knowledge back to my friends, my community, and hopefully provide insight to other people who are at risk of slipping through the cracks.
Oh, fuck yeah. And some added context for the listeners, Damien and I actually have taught a class together about sex and sigil magic. We taught it at the Kink School BDSM convention, education convention here recently. It was an online thing that was really cool. So some further context there. We've also got Barracutie here.
Hello. I go by Barracutie on the Green Mushroom server. I'm Ferox at Pagan Plus on Mastodon. I've been trying to meet other pagans that way as well. But I practice mostly sigil magic in the vein of druidry, animistic. I enjoy reading runes if I do divination. I like luck magic, so flipping a coin to make a choice, saving myself the decision fatigue of having to choose everything all of the time. And I've been at magic in one form or another, sometimes high magic, sometimes deity-based, sometimes just generic kind of mindfulness or meditative-based forms of it for 20 years, maybe 5 hobby years and 15 more spiritual, intentional years. And I'm queer, I'm trans, polyamorous, anti-establishment, and really, really enjoy that component that Damien mentioned of deconstructing paradigms, jumping to new ones, asking myself if the thing that I'm doing is wrong or bad, why is it wrong or bad? What harms might I be bringing to myself and those around me? Or is the thing I believe correct? Or do I think this for some reason that I haven't pinned down? Can I trace it to its source? You know, who told me that thing and why do I think that thing is true? Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks.
Oh, fuck yeah, I love that. A lot of people might call that kind of work deconditioning, or I call it reconditioning. I love it. Fuck yeah. Well, I'm really stoked that you all have been willing to come and share your thoughts tonight. I'm stoked that we have so many experienced folks. So let me go ahead and give the listeners the context of the sort of ballpark of questions that we'll be discussing here. So when I asked you all on the server to join me for this little exercise, I asked, how do you know when you're getting into potential trouble by going, quote, too far in your practice? Or do you perhaps consider this to not be a risk? What have you done in the past to get yourself out of potential trouble, if you've had that experience? Banishing rituals and things like that are classic examples of rituals that can be performed to go from one mental space to another. But I'm curious about the ideas and philosophy y'all might have when it comes to when it's time to use these tools and how you use them, etc. Also, whatever you think might be helpful to the listeners and I to hear would be welcome as well. So, Catalyst, is it okay if we go ahead and start with you?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I've come at this from a couple of different directions. I've also been using sex magic in various forms as part of my practice for a long time. And as I was saying before, I've experienced a lot of different paths. I really did dive into everything that I could find as far as, and please pardon me, I've been doing this since the 90s, and so I have a lot of outdated language in my head that I'm trying to replace. And sometimes when I'm talking about the things I learned during those times, I tend to use those terms. So I hope that no one will be too offended if that happens. But yeah, so I was studying an earth-based, or what some would call a shamanic path, at one point with a really good friend of mine, someone who I grew up with, was in business with. We were roommates on and off at various times. And at one point in our studies, he decided to go down a path that I didn't feel like I was ready for. He got his hands on some advanced materials that were beyond the grade that we were playing at that point. And I tend to be fairly cautious. Any experimentation I've done has been very tightly controlled, whether it be entheogens or ritual or psychological. And he had a very, very strong ego. He had a very strong sense of self. And so he had a tendency to sometimes take things on that might have been a little outside his reach, or take bigger bites than he really could chew, so to speak. And when I started to see things happening with him that I couldn't explain, I started to get somewhat concerned. He had apparently gotten into some ritual and done some things and contacted some energies or spirits that were known to be difficult or hard to handle. And he went really deep. He started seeing signs in everything all of the time. He was seeing the Matrix. Every car that drove by, he was doing numerology on the license plates. Every billboard he happened to look up and see, he was doing analysis on. The two birds flew by, and he'd be analyzing that. It was just this constant interpreting of everything that was coming into his awareness as something more. And on one level, I agree. Everything is a sign. Everything can be a sign. Everything is a part of our magical practice, because to me, my magical practice is part of my life. It's a part of who I am. The two are sometimes further apart than other times, but for the most part, very close and parallel. Anyways, watching him sort of go further and further down the rabbit hole was challenging. We drifted. He started not wanting to talk about things he was doing, whereas before we had always shared and discussed everything. He isolated himself quite a lot, both from friends and family and his girlfriend at the time. And one day he showed up at my house and was prowling and leaping like an animal, like a big cat of some sort. He had shaved his head, or started to, and then done a bad job, and wanted me to help him finish the job. I had shaved my head in the vein of a monk, essentially. I knew that my hair was something that I'd always been very proud of and somewhat vain about. And so as part of my disidentification with the physical self and disconnection from my ego, I had shaved my head. And so he apparently had decided he wanted to do that same thing, but was perching on the furniture like a cat, and was very obviously seeing things that I was not seeing. My roommates at the time also, they were pretty sketched out. They said he had some really weird energy, and it was kind of creeping them out. It's really hard to define what specifically gave that impression, but just the way he spoke, the way he acted, the way he was not who he normally was. there were moments, but yeah, it just didn't seem like it was quite him. So I tried to take care of him, tried to convince him to stay at my place for the evening. He didn't want to. He wanted to go on out into the world on his adventure. So he did. I got a phone call about 2.5 hours later from the hospital from his brother, and he had apparently gone to a 4-lane section of highway, ran across 2 lanes of traffic, and literally ran into, like, shoulder checked, of like a big Ford F-350 pickup truck that was coming down. And he, like, apparently tried to just bowl it off the road or something. Yeah, and then he ended up in the hospital, and of course they put him in the psych wing. They drugged him pretty heavily, so we didn't get to see him for a couple of days. After the third day, they figured he was okay enough to come out and sort of try to reintegrate and connect with people again. And that was the first time I ever truly experienced something. I'm going to use the word walk-in as a term. There's a lot of different terms for when potentially a spirit being that is not the original owner of a body takes over for a while, be that possession or walk-in or any others. But yeah, he was sitting at a table with his mother, his brother, myself, and his girlfriend. And you could see him. It was almost like he was going through a mental Rolodex, and he was speaking in third person. He was looking at his mom and going, "You are Leanne. You're his mother." And then he'd look at his girlfriend. "You are Rebecca. He likes you." You know, it was very, very strange. It was like watching a being that did not really know the rules of this place and that was not really familiar with being in a human body, accessing these memory banks, pulling them forward and trying to pretend to be this person in the midst of a life.
Mm.
And
That's so spooky.
yeah, it was very, very strange. And unfortunately, like, his parents decided to take him back to our hometown. They wanted to take him into their care for a while, and we got cut off from each other quite a bit. His family knew that I had been experimenting with various substances with him. They knew we were both, fooling around with a wide variety of spiritual stuff and magical stuff. And so unfortunately, they blamed me. They knew that my partner at the time had access to some pretty heavy medication, and they assumed that I had drugged him or that I had overdosed him, which was so against the spirit of anything that he and I had ever done. We were so careful and so cautious with our experimentation. So that really hurt. And of course, he didn't know. He came out of it and was told that I had basically roofied him and sent him on a psychotic break. So that was tough. We really did not connect for a number of years. And yeah, it was probably about 5 years later that I finally heard from him and we tentatively started reconnecting. And he was never quite the same person. He was never really able to talk about what he'd experienced during that time. I was never 100% sure that this was my friend or if this was a walk-in that got really good at accessing his memories. And, that sounds weird, probably to some folks, but when you've seen someone you've known for that long change that drastically, it's hard to watch. It's hard to be around, and it's hard to know for sure who you're talking to a little bit in that situation. So that's kind of been my experience with mental health and magical thinking and where that can go and how far that can go. There wasn't, as far as I'm aware, any history of mental illness in his family. I've not heard of any of his extended family having any kind of psychiatric illness, that sort of thing. And myself, I went through depression on several occasions in my life. I was suicidally depressed in my late teens, but that was due to being in a situation that I just could not see a way out of. And when that situation changed, then that depression lifted. And I had some pretty powerful experiences in meditation and with substances that reaffirmed my desire to be here on this planet at this time. So has never been a question since then. But yeah, it's really something that has affected me profoundly in that I realize that it is possible to go so deep that the world that you're perceiving might be completely different from the world that the people around you are perceiving. And I have another friend who I've been friends with for about 20 years who is diagnosed as schizophrenic. And he is also a magical practitioner, and he's also someone who studied that same shamanic path that I had. And his experience is so different from what I saw my first friend go through. So it's been really interesting to see someone who came from a diagnosis and who has, this medical condition, and they've verified that yes, he's got some imbalances in his brain chemistry and so forth, and seeing his journey through, his teaching and his learning on these different paths. And then my friend who had none of that, and who through that magical work that he had done may have pushed himself into a split. So yeah, that's kind of my experience with magic and mental health beyond my own, is having had those two experiences with my friends and observing in detail over the course of a couple of decades now what some of those effects were.
Ron, thank you. Yeah, I'm so sorry that you had that experience with your friend there. That sounds like a really difficult and complicated thing to go through. I was thinking about the idea of walk-ins and stuff too, and even if we wanted to look at things through the psych model, the psychological model of magic, where we don't have to assume that AKA magic is quote real or whatever, like I think that, we could also say that the effects of like a really intense traumatic event can leave a lasting impact on somebody's personality or things like that too. Like, yeah, there's so many things in there in what you said, and thank you for bringing up magical thinking, because magical thinking is something that we do engage in our practices. Like the idea of looking for synchronicities and all that stuff is something that a lot of people do. I think that this is an awesome and helpful thing to do up to a point, and kind of dancing with that boundary is a big part, at least for me, of like getting deep and getting into the depth with your magical practice is, negotiating that boundary and everything. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. It looks like we've got Hot Wing Hermit up next here.
Yeah, hey. So yeah, again, I'm a Hot Wing Hermit, and one of the things actually I forgot about mentioning earlier on is my own personal experiences with mental health, which have been going on since I was a child. I was diagnosed at a pretty early age with ADHD, issues with anxiety, depression, things like that. There's kind of a family history behind that, which is kind of a whole thing. But basically, what that looks like for me is I end up relying a lot on, I guess you could say, like exterior ways of like motivating myself. I am not an authority on this, but as I understand it, there is a theory regarding ADHD that dysregulation of dopamine means that a lot of the time people with the condition will often look to kind of, I guess, spike themselves, so to speak, just basically seek out different experiences that will kind of give them those ups, which can kind of explain some of that, but don't take my word for it. I am not a medical professional, but in my own personal experience, I find that that's very much the case. Like I rely on kind of those like upswings to motivate myself. And frankly, like intense magical experiences can be one of those. Just getting kind of a string of like, hits can really kind of impel my work forward a lot of the time. If I can see that things are working, if I can see that there are kind of those little synchronicities in the background that are kind of going forward, or even if I'm catching like a particularly strong vibe, that can be really productive and informative, but it can also, in a very strange way, be almost like habit forming, almost like, in a similar way as somebody who might seek out adrenaline rushes in, for example, I don't know, like base jumping or driving really, really fast on the road or doing things like that. So there is always that particular risk, along with the also very common, as I understand it, ADHD trait that I have, where I'm constantly trying to put things together into this broad, big picture. The way I typically describe it is to reference, someone who recently departed us. It's kind of like living in a David Lynch film. Or if anybody's ever read The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, it's very similar, where you're just seeing these little things here and there, which might be significant, might not be significant, might fit into a pattern. How do they all fit into the pattern? And it could be very confusing, very dizzying sometimes. But it's also something that I find that I can kind of keep an upper limit on through various ways. Like if I can quiet my mind at least like a little bit, then, I can keep it from kind of tipping into anxiety. I can kind of limit the kind of over enthusiasm and the strings of conjecture that can come up. Things like, persistent fears around like a particular thing, or thought loops, which a environment rich in symbols and correspondences and synchronicities and archetypes and things like that maps sometimes a little too well onto the experience of ADHD and anxiety, because there's a lot of information to process and a lot of different ways of putting that information together. So when the work isn't grounded for me, it's really a giant maze, going down like, a rabbit hole with lots of little clues, no concrete concept of kind of like what's going on. And, in terms of like how I typically know that I'm getting into that kind of trouble, a lot of the time I'll take on too much, like, the tasks will start consuming too much time. The work that I'm doing, I'll spend like hours in ritual, something like that, which used to be a little bit more of an issue. It's not so much nowadays, but I'll push myself to the point of exhaustion, like beyond the point of exhaustion. Things will get like compulsive. They'll feel more like anxious than peaceful. And kind of like on the extreme end, there can be issues with like perceptual distortions, which also is something that isn't always related to magic. Just generally speaking, like I know one thing that people will report is seeing kind of like smoke or fog or something like that, which, it's not, my part to say what is or isn't the case for any given person except myself. But sometimes that can actually represent physical issues rather than, kind of like, more subtle issues. But in my case, it was. There have been moments where I've gotten so deep into that particular hole that I'll actually kind of like start seeing like little, not like full-blown hallucinations, but kind of like distortions. Another thing that like really, really, is like a big warning sign is like, it kind of goes along with that rabbit hole thing of like obsessive thoughts and, getting this sort of tunnel vision towards whatever I'm doing. Like if I'm like pursuing just this secret that's just beyond reach and I'm so close to that answer, I'm just waiting for like, that next moment where, that's not healthy for me. That's generally the point where I have to pull back and just be like, okay, like I'm not going to, that epiphany might not be worth it. If it's even there at all. And, the further I get along, the further I know that I'm going to get more reckless. I'm going to get, just less balanced in terms of everything. And it can be difficult like that, especially like one of the other things, and this kind of goes a little bit into kind of how I see ritual and magic in general, like to a degree, I think it's, at least in my personal experience, it's not so much a binary like in ritual space and time versus out of ritual space and time. It's kind of a degree of visibility and engagement. And because of that, I can kind of like steer myself like a little bit more towards like the mundane, so to speak. But there is always that sort of openness that's going to be there. It's almost like it's kind of active by default, especially because like the model I tend to use, which is the spirit model, virtually everything in theory is alive. Virtually everything can kind of be interacted with in some way, shape, or form, at least in theory. And a lot of these, spirits that I work with, they have their own personalities, motivations, their own particular MOs. A lot of the time there's like, I don't know what everybody else's experience is, but like, there are some spirits, at least that I've worked with, that really kind of go beyond linear time and space and have like power that's kind of difficult for people to comprehend. It's kind of like, that whole like kind of like funny thing of like, you look at a biblically accurate angel and it looks like this giant wheeling machine of eyes and like wings, and it's glowing and it's telling you be not afraid. And
We've got a couple of emojis of them on the server. Yes.
yeah, but it is a lot like that. And a lot of that stuff is kind of hard to limit to the kind of like linear time and space that, most of us kind of work with. So the separation is kind of, I don't necessarily see it as like complete and absolute, but it's a matter of degree. But the thing is, like I say, it's a matter of degree, and I can kind of steer myself. And this took a lot of practice and a lot of trial and error, but I can actually steer myself kind of back towards, a place where it's more like slow, sustainable, gradual, but, the type of growth that kind of builds in a healthy way. Kind of like how, when you're working out, like, you're not supposed to like go and lift, like bench like 300 pounds all at once. It's like, just very, very slow that you build up. Maybe you'll do like 10 pounds one day and then 15 pounds the other. I don't know. In terms of stuff that's gotten me out of trouble, one of the things that, I've kind of gotten into the habit of that actually does kind of help in terms of delineating like when I'm in that space versus when I'm not in that space is I have this kind of simple prayer that I say at the beginning and end of a lot of major ritual movements or like parts of a ritual. Another thing that's, really big about like the way that I practice is I have a lot of, how should I put it? It's almost like liturgical. Like there's a lot of focus on like kind of an order of operations to the particular prayers and movements that I do, to the pattern of it. And sometimes it's good to break out of that pattern, but other times it's good because it gives me a sort of structure. And that one prayer that I was talking about earlier, it brackets off ritual time, and it acts as kind of like a circuit breaker at the very end that like kills the lights, so to speak. It's like, okay, this is the beginning, this is the end. Beyond that, maybe I'll be experiencing some stuff, but I'm not going to be just kind of like carrying on and like walking around during the day, like with all of this other stuff kind of like hanging on the back of my head. At least that's the intention behind it. It's kind of like if anybody's ever been in a 12-step meeting, they begin and end with the serenity prayer, which is, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, etc. But it's basically like, it begins with that and it ends with that. So it kind of sets that particular space. And outside of ritual, like a lot of it's like, just the simplest maintenance. Like when I find that I'm like getting to a point where it's getting really tense, just kind of stepping back and concentrating on the fundamentals, which I've been doing a lot more of recently, just because I find that that's just more comfortable and I can kind of do everything that I need to do just in the appropriate, I guess, proportions. But yeah, like a lot of meditation in terms of just mundane, like non-magical stuff, concentrating on like just grounding, eating comfort food, watching like, just Netflix or whatever, chores, paperwork. You want to ground yourself like, or if I want to ground myself, like probably the most useful thing I can do, one of the most useful things I can do is just do the dishes. And certain substances can be helpful within limits for me. Like if I'm like coming off a pretty like heavy ritual, it's not outside of the realm of possibility that maybe I'll just sit down and I'll watch something on like TV and I'll have a beer. But that, of course, is going to be very, very, that's going to depend on whether or not I'm in the mood for it or whether or not I feel like it would be constructive. But in terms of like actual like magical stuff, a lot of cleaning that I do is like certain like techniques of like, I don't know exactly how to put it, but just cleaning off like anything that might be attached or any sort of like clinging negative stuff. It's helpful. I try not to make it compulsive, and generally it isn't, but that can, as I mentioned before, that can be a little bit of an issue sometimes. And one of the other things that I do is like when I'm kind of trying to kind of get to a better place, like I'll concentrate on working with one ally, like one particular spirit, just so that, I'm not going and bouncing between all of these different archetypes and like all of these different suites of like signs and symbols. And I can just give myself a little bit of a break from the kind of nebulousness of that and just kind of focus on like one concept that I find to be particularly important and grounding, and just, something that, I can kind of rest with. One of the things that, really, really helps for me is death contemplation, which can be, to a lot of people very like morbid, but I find that it gives a lot of perspective. It helps me to kind of see what's important and what isn't. And it's just gives me a sort of sense of peace. That's really cool for me. And it's also kind of a time when I could be a little bit of an armchair magician. Like, as long as the stuff that I'm reading isn't like really intense, like, okay, I'll focus on like just reading and writing and just kind of like mellowing out in that regard. And aside from that, like, I have this sort of thing that I came up with called my sparring ratio, which is basically a personal rule of thumb that when I was doing martial arts, like, I realized that I would spend roughly 3 days conditioning and drilling for every 3 minutes that I'd actually be sparring in the ring. Most of the attention is on actually preparing your body and preparing your reflexes, and then you actually go into it. So I find that if I can kind of like grind on like basic wellness, maybe grind isn't the best word, but like,
grind on that self-care.
grind on that, like on those positive wellness skills. But yeah, like on, just basic maintenance and like self-improvement, and in terms of like ritual stuff, like focus on like, simple routine devotional stuff, just staying clean and, meditating and kind of quieting my mind. Then every once in a while, like, and I can actually jump into the quote unquote sparring element of it, which is like active spell work, something that might be a little bit more intense. And that's kind of good because it balances out the stuff that can kind of like put me in a really weird place with the stuff that of larger proportion of stuff that generally just kind of like settles me. And yeah, and when I do see things, if it's something that's particularly striking, like I can remember one just like 2 nights ago that happened. Just, I was just chatting with some people and somebody said something that was just like, oh my God. But when that happens, like, I don't have to automatically, I can just remind myself I don't have to automatically fit it into a giant theory of everything. I can just be like, okay, that happened. And then I just log it in my, my journal, and I just put it out of my mind until something else kind of calls it back to my attention. And then I can kind of work with it. So, but yeah, that's basically what it looks like for me. That's kind of how I manage things.
Right on. Yeah, I love this idea of the sparring ratio. I've definitely noticed similar types of, dynamics in my own practice. I mean, even I'm thinking about making podcasts because that's what we're doing right now, of course, and like the amount of time that goes into like the recording, production, and all of the rest of the process. It's huge compared to the amount of time it takes to actually listen to the episode. So lots of parallels there for sure. And I like that you brought up sitting down and having a beer or something as a way of grounding after like getting into that ritual time, that ritual space, that place where we go to experience these altered states of consciousness in our magical practice, and coming back to sort of baseline from that's the idea of grounding, right? And I've been told that the ale and cakes tradition, that we see coming out of like Wicca, a lot of like Wiccan things will be like, okay, now it's time for ale and cakes. And I was told that this was actually something that was built into these things as a sort of grounding exercise. So that makes a lot of sense. So thank you. Looks like next up we've got Damien.
Yeah. Oh, wow. First of all, I want to say thank you to Mike and Catalyst for sharing what you've shared, because those were both deeply relatable experiences, honestly. I don't really know where to start because mental health wise, things have always been I feel like I've lived 1,000 lives in that respect, I suppose. When I was a kid, I was diagnosed with ADHD or ADD at that point in time in the 90s. And I was put on a very small amount of Ritalin, which I don't honestly particularly remember. But what I do remember is that my mom had started seeing a doctor who said that amount of Ritalin would help anybody. And, ADHD is a big scam, and, it's just made up to push drugs on kids and stuff like that. That sort of whole narrative. And so because of that, my mom decided to take me off of the Ritalin at that point. Now, I was put on the Ritalin because I was having like behavioral issues in school and I wasn't doing my homework and there were a bunch of things. And so at that point, because that was young and that was what my mom was telling me was going on, was that, oh, like this thing, that was all just made up, and we're sorry we put you on drugs and stuff and stuff like that. And so they switched me on to like a natural health regimen of like vitamins and stuff like that, which did kind of help, except I was understandably bad at taking pills like regularly and on time, and I just didn't want to take them and a bunch of stuff because I was 6. And so that was the start of a very, very long mental health journey through the psychology and psychiatric system. For context, I live in Canada, and especially at that point in the 90s, mental health care was far more accessible than it currently is today. And so it was a lot of getting bounced around between doctors and naturopaths and stuff like that. And I just sort of coasted, I guess, through elementary school with significant social barriers and stuff like that because of my behavior, but also because I was attending sort of a school that had it was a charter school that, it was a little bit more hippie and sort of lax and stuff like that. So I coasted because they were like, oh, they're a unique free spirit. Anyway, but obviously, every time I would have another behavioral issue crop up, it would be off to the psychiatrist again. And when I started having more teenage behavioral issues after we moved cities, it was a huge change. And knowing what I know now about my own neurodivergence, I did not handle change well at the time. I started into some incredibly self-destructive behaviors. It was around that point in time that I had also come out as queer. I had come out at that point in time. For context, I am a transmasculine person. At that point, I was woman presenting, and I had just come out as bisexual, but I had moved to a much smaller city, and it was much more conservative, and I did not realize that was just something that you did not do. So I was being bullied also something fiercely at the new school that I was at. So there was a lot of that. You know what? I am at a point where I'm not salty about it now. So all of these things were having a negative effect on my mental health, but because I didn't really have any coping mechanisms or anything like that other than sort of, here, take these pills, whether that was pharmaceuticals or vitamins or whatever, that was sort of what I leapt to when I got to a public school with, like 1,500 kids as opposed to my, like little hippie school with 500. And I was also met with a psychiatrist who was very happy with the prescription pad, just because of the way our pharmaceutical system works, and I'm pretty sure she was paying off her Lexus. So because of that, I ended up with a laundry list of diagnoses, and that's why I just refer to whatever I have as my brain squirrels, because my diagnosis list is getting sorted out anyway. But the prescription medications that I was on then also started causing me a number of physical issues and stuff like that. So that further caused me to sort of not want to take those, but then find a way to self-medicate, mostly with marijuana at that point in time. And because my parents found out that I was smoking weed, they then freaked out and started treating me like a drug addict. So I then started acting like a drug addict because that's the way my brain squirrels work, because I said, well, if you're going to treat me that way, then I'm just going to go be one. My mental health and everything throughout my teenage years was very much not good. But yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Yeah, I just wanted to respond briefly to something you said about the idea of being treated a certain way, especially as a young person, and sort of ascribing what happened after that to the brain scrolls, as you call them. And I wanted to point out that I'm not sure if that's actually something that's like that strange. Like, I think that especially when we're in a sort of position where people who are in authority or who have more power than us treat us a certain way, it's very easy to sort of internalize those messages and think about them as being like sort of true. And this is actually one of the principles of like leadership and stuff that I've read about is like, treat people the way that you expect them to act, not how they're necessarily like acting. Like, if you want people to like step up and whatever, do more, then like treat them like they're competent, not like they're idiots or whatever. So like, I think that there's something that's just really human about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did remember. Thank you. So, in addition to that theory that people will sort of self-medicate with various hits of dopamine or adrenaline or whatever they can get, there's also sort of a theory that within mental health and psychological communities, that if you start self-medicating away your feelings at, a certain age, especially a young age, you never go through those feelings and develop the coping mechanisms and stuff like that to deal with difficult emotions and difficult experiences. You sort of just numb them away, and they catch up to you eventually. And so the theory is basically that, sort of on an emotional intelligence level, that you are stunted at sort of whatever age that you began whatever sort of coping mechanism that, may have served you in that time, but is no longer serving you, or whatever. And so that is, for me, I think one of the biggest things that magic has led me up to realizing about myself and just exploring is through, I guess, through my own practice, and especially because, of course, I am an elder emo, I gotta go into the dark shit. I am a connoisseur of the dark fluff.
You're not that old, though. I think you're the youngest one here. I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure about that.
I'm not sure. I am 34, so I was born in the late 1900s. Um, but yeah, so that treatment of, being treated like a drug addict, my parents ended up sending me multiple times to rehab centers and stuff like that. And I had hit and miss experiences with a lot of them. And I'm very much aware now that being neurodivergent, and just existing within my own meat suit very much had the effect of making withdrawals worse and stuff like that. But I I existed in 12-step meetings and rehab centers and all of that stuff begrudgingly, and sort of not wanting to be there for, quite some time, and sort of coming to a point where I got 2.5 years clean in an abstinence-based recovery system. But at the same time, I was also, I feel, self-medicating in a way with toxic relationships, and, throwing myself into work and school at the time, to unhealthy effect. So the inability to cope with these feelings was manifesting itself in other areas of my life, even though I wasn't, using drugs. And because of that, in a lot of my relationships, I was very much, like I accept the moniker of being the psycho ex to many people. I was that person. And if any of my exes are listening to this, I am deeply sorry.
Somebody out there feels vindicated, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just joking.
But no, it's only really through magic and shadow work and the work that I have done finding my own way to use plant medicines and, pharmaceutical medicines in responsible ways, in ways where I can listen to my body and what it needs, and advocate for myself and address those concerns as well. But it really is for me the sort of, the use of entheogens within, I also try and shy away from the term shamanic practice because it's so loaded, but otherwise, it's a paragraph to try and describe it. Anyway, using those shamanic practices to sort of unlock those missing parts, or to access those memories in a way where I have different perspective on them, or, have, I guess, access to different parts of myself that are able to, deal with them in, I guess, one of the ways that I integrate a lot into my practice is from Aidan Wachter, and the idea of the corridor. It shares a lot of parallels with reparenting in the mental health sphere. Going back to the self that needed, a certain thing in a certain moment, a guidance or, something, and being the grown up that you needed in that time. And unfortunately, because of my Swiss cheese brain memory, sometimes it does take those psychedelic experiences and stuff like that. Well, I don't want to say like unfortunately. Unfortunately, I have Swiss cheese memory sometimes, but it's not unfortunate that I get to have these experiences and this, type of self-reflection and stuff like that. But that exercise of the, sort of walking down that corridor to places where, now through going to therapy and with a therapist that I like and, can talk to openly, and also through, just being a part of phenomenal communities of pagan people that have had, similar experiences. I can take those tools back with me through those experiences, I guess. And I have, over the past few years of doing this, started to literally feel myself emotionally aging up to, the level where I feel like I am almost, on par with at least where I'm supposed to be, a place where I'm comfortable with. And I'm also getting to have, like really cool experiences because of that. Recently, I sort of went back and fixed a bunch of shenanigans from when I was around 15, 16, and that also corresponded with a magical working that we did in the server, actually, which culminated in me getting my first car. So that was
I
kind of
remember
a
that.
neat
That was
little
great. Yeah.
syncretism.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, no, but also with regards to just, I guess, practical application, things like ceremonial magic, my craft has always been very, very chaos, very witchcrafts. I take literally. A lot of it is mostly just me doing arts and crafts and, chanting and waving smoke and rattles and stuff like that. But getting into ceremonial magic and ritual craft where I'm gonna do this at this planetary hour, and I'm writing words that I say at this time after I do this thing, and I dance this dance, and I point my athame this way and stuff like that. That has been phenomenal for developing my executive function levels to a point where I'm doing better at keeping jobs and stuff and keeping things a little bit more organized in my life, I guess. delving into my shadow work surrounding all of my, gender and sexuality and hypersexuality and all of the baggage that came along with that. I have found that the shadow work and especially sex magic practice has been absolutely integral, actually, in culminating into one of the honestly healthiest relationships and breakups. I don't even want to call it a breakup. It was like a parting of ways. It was good, actually, that I ever possibly could have asked for. So, yeah, there's been a lot of growth recently. Another really big thing, like I can be mad at my mom for, going the route that she took with me and my mental health care when I was a kid. But I can also, through my ancestor work and stuff like that, see how the mental illness, especially, whatever it was called in the day, bipolar disorder, hysteria, manic depression, whatever, that it's deep in the AFAB people in that side of the family. And I can be mad at the situation, but I can't really be mad at her anymore for doing the best that she had with the information that she had at the time, which in the 90s was not a lot. We didn't have TikTok and a bunch of us, like sort of, talking about our shared symptoms and stuff like that. And, being like, oh, hey, damn, that's an ADHD thing. She was working with what she had at the time, and she was just trying to not fuck me up in the way that her mom fucked her up, and her mom probably fucked her up before. So there's that too.
Yeah.
That's what we call breaking generational cycles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yay. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much that I can relate to in what you shared there. Thank you so much. We've got Barracuda up next.
Awesome. Hello. Yeah, I've been listening and then not paying attention to what I want to say, but I have some notes. In terms of the question of magical thinking going too far and what the risks are there, I've actually had an experience with my life of not really being a risk too far, more down the road of not being able to tap into enough for magical current speak. And a lot of that ties into, like, I guess, cerebral versus emotive magic for me. I'm at the very least alexithymic. I have a really difficult time identifying bodily sensations, pinning that to whether or not I'm hungry, in pain, other things that could be happening. It's challenging for me to describe, like, to a doctor what my symptoms are, or even in like a culinary experience, like comparing tastes, or kind of pinpointing things and being able to summon things and pairing that with levels of, believe it's aphantasia, not being able to visualize, not necessarily being able to summon up a mental image of an apple or an object or something. So there's an experience I've had of neglect, of distance. I was raised in a desert, so while there is a quiet, serene beauty of the desert, there's also a wind-swept, dusty nothingness that comes from that. And then having that be an internal experience as well. A lot of my magical work has been sort of tied to not being able to see things, not being able to hear, feel, sense things, but still engaging in practices and just kind of shouldering through. Aidan Wachter's been brought up. He's got a similar experience. And so that was very useful for me as well, to take on some of those models, knowing that I don't need to do those things. But by the flip of the magical thinking coin, engaging in it intentionally in my teens probably saved my life in terms of my being raised in pretty isolated desert community, but in a Mormon community where there's a lot of cult mentality, there also flourishes an undercurrent of odd pieces of spirituality that are tacked onto it. So intuition and empathic feelings and premonition type work that people in that cult or in that religion encounter creates a lot of interesting experiences where they're trying to put words with the vocabulary that they've been given and taught from their religious institution to the supranatural experiences that they're having. But I also had at least one parent who I would say had some pretty profound challenges discerning reality from their mental statuses of kind of a paranoid, delusional experience of the world and the people around them. And so I perceive that now as levels of magical thinking where that parent's paranoia kind of fed in and kind of combined and formed into a new creature with their religious or magical thinking aspects, and made it challenging to be able to discern reality for myself in a lot of ways as I was growing up. But that spirit communication type work was present, even if it wasn't necessarily labeled as such or what like the magical community might describe it with. I also, being queer and trans in that environment, there was a lot of, I don't know if it was more intelligent or less intelligent of me to identify that I was alone and would have no support and wouldn't be able to tell anyone anything truthful about myself. So creating the masks or the duplicitous lived experience of fearing discovery and building up the role plays that were necessary to get through and to survive. So the magical thinking and the ability to tap into, I guess, altered states of lived existence in a way that, I'm role playing my way through what reality actually is so that I can get through to a new reality of, I just have to get out of here as an adult. I just have to survive until I can leave and then I will be okay. And that was true to, like have that immediate relief of like, okay, I'm on my own. I can like do this now. That was definitely true. So magical thinking kind of gave me or tapped me into the pieces of resiliency that were helpful. So, and I don't know if it was, this is where like there was some piece of that time frame in my teens where I would say there was a form of break with reality. What a lot of people would probably more colloquially put it is having a supernatural experience or a Man in Black type experience where you're having certain types of things occur, whether they're truly physically occurring or psychically occurring, and whether those are combinations of that repressive state of being paired with maybe a genetic or a nurtured state of being. I don't know, and I probably never will, but I do appreciate it to a degree and recognize that I have potentially built barriers or walls around sections of that internal experience that perhaps created pieces of the aphantasia or the alexithymia experience that I have now as an adult, whether it's intentionally limited to avoid some type of a break, or it really resonated with Catalyst's story of like, yeah, I've definitely had intentional thoughts around, I would like to experiment. I definitely want to make sure I don't experiment myself into a state that I might not be able to recover from. But knock on wood, I have been able to do all of my experiments thus far without kind of tapping into something that was too much. And so that cerebral versus emotive magic that I have been thinking about since we got talking about this panel is whether that brings about a status of being too calm so that I'm not able to dip into things that I might need for healing or for personal development, whether that breeds a sort of overconfidence in, well, I am not having strong emotions about such and such a thing, so I must be healed. And, having a cognitive awareness of all of the things that we experience over time, over the course of our lives. We are constantly receiving new things to develop and heal around. But yeah, wanting to dip into the tools of transcendental meditation, of having worked with psychedelics and other things before, those have definitely been incredibly useful, because I do feel those barriers removed, shifted, or altered in such a way that I can have new and novel experiences and be more in touch with states of mind, states of body that I don't have access to, even with kind of the more mundane magical practices, but the day-to-day magical practices that are more minor in their ability to transcend. But it is very interesting to me that magical thinking is one factor of formal medical diagnoses in the spectrum of our mental health care that we do receive and have access to today, that it feels more like it should be some sort of like delusional pattern matching, or something that kind of dips into the realm of, does this activity actually harm someone? Because there are so many ways that I observe what I would consider to be magical thinking of someone who overreacts or over invests in something in some sort of an emotional way that I don't have a standard lived experience of having. So that's a side thought and conversation, I suppose, but just the curious way in which what gets counted as magical thinking and what doesn't in the current landscape of like truth and the fabric of reality itself being altered and changed like in front of our very eyes this very week. And yeah, I definitely feel like I would be in a very different mental and emotional and spiritual position without that access to magical thinking. And I know I'm not really offering many tools, because I feel like they're probably the standard gamut, which is like with bodily working out, or something. I think it was Mike that brought up like martial arts, like you're doing levels of training so that you are practicing in various other scenarios without the stress of, I guess, the competition component of it. You learn the limits of what you're capable of doing. You learn the ways in which breathing, motion, recovery, warm up, prep, all of those aspects of like a training your body routine can bring to you, so that when the time comes, you're able to perform in some way. Yeah, I think that having the ability to have relatively simple day-to-day magical practices gives a really great baseline for knowing how your day-to-day state of mind is. And the other tool that I leverage regularly is conversation with others. And it is incredibly valuable to me to have community and have places where, even if I'm generally lurking and just reading along, I can still bitch check myself, sanity check myself against like, oh, okay, so there's a number of people who are having similar experiences when they engage in practices such as this. I'm probably still in a pretty comfortable realm of operation and will be able to stay that path for some period of time without having to concern myself with whatever does constitute reality being in a broken state, or that I have lost the plot and let something else in that I didn't intend to. I think I'll pause there for now, because I'll probably just ramble if I keep talking. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot in there that made a lot of sense to me. I'm glad that you brought up masking. I think this is a huge topic that we could probably do several panel discussions on, and how that might relate to different aspects of a magical practice as well. I was actually just thinking about this yesterday, the idea of what is pathological versus what is pathologized. And I think you sort of hit on this here. Like, I think there are a lot of things that we do that might be perhaps pathologized within the context of certain lenses, but I don't think they're actually pathological until they're harming us or others, right? Or causing distress, or which I suppose is a version of harm there. So thank you. Well, I want to say thank you so much to everybody for sharing a little bit of your stories with the listeners and and these amazing insights and perspectives. I'm very, very humbled by your generosity this evening.
2, 2, 4,
Greetings! It is I, Luxa from the future, once more. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that you're finding our discussion useful. Still a lot of great stuff to get into here as well, so I will not keep you long. As promised, I just wanted to do a quick little blurb about the Green Mushroom Project, which is an ongoing magical working based on the metaphor of the relationship that some fungi share with some plants. In a nutshell, if we the magical practitioners of Green Mushroom Project are like a forest of trees, the mushroom current connects us and strengthens us in unseen ways. In addition to the mycelial web which connects us as practitioners, there are also the mushroom's spores, which are basically little packets of the current's energy which can be applied to situations as needed by any participant. Green Mushroom Project's newest experiment is Void House. It's about investigating the healing and alchemical properties of consent, providing consent education to magically inclined people, and organizing consent-centered magical spaces for group work both in person and online. We've got a lot of fun and free activities going on our server, The Green Machine. You can join us for our weekly Fungal Friday chats, as well as special events like ceremonies and seasonal celebrations. There are also several educational opportunities available. Check out the Lux Occult YouTube to watch a presentation that Dave Neal and I recently did about trauma-informed practices and about ways that understanding this stuff can allow for more consensual interactions in daily life and can allow for, building the types of trusting relationships which can be so helpful for magical and other types of work. And also just understanding how this stuff works can really be useful in interpreting our own and others' responses to things or ways of moving through the world. So as always, much love to everybody participating in the Green Mushroom Project, regardless of what that looks like for you in your practice. It's always so cool to see people evolving artistically, magically, and the rest of it, and it's been such an honor and such a privilege to be sharing this journey with you all. Fuck yeah. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or get me on Blue Sky at Luxestrada for a link to the Discord server, and I'll put links to that stuff in the show notes. All right, I will be back after the rest of the panel discussion to wish you all a very happy Valentine's Day, which is when this episode is going to be published, if everything has gone well. But now let's dive back in for more of that discussion about magic, mental health, and magical thinking with Catalyst, Hotwing Hermit, Damien, and Cutie. Hey, what's up? I'm Luxa.
And I'm Josh. Are you looking for a chill place to hang out online and chat about chaos magic, occultism, witchcraft, and more? Are you hoping to learn and share your knowledge and experience in a place that is welcoming to folks of all different backgrounds and identities?
If so, check out the Green Machine Discord server, home of the Green Mushroom Project. Our growing community of chaotes, occultists, sorcerers, witches, and weirdos has all kinds of fun and interesting things going on. From chats and rituals to workshops, clubs, and more. There's a lot of cool opportunities to get involved.
Sounds great, Luxa. How can folks find us?
Well, for now, we're keeping things pretty small as we grow, so we're not advertising on any of the Discord services that do that. But folks can hit me up and I will send them a link. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at luxoccultpod.
Fuck yeah!
Fuck yeah. I'm hoping that we can have a little bit of a chance to respond to some of the things that might have come up in tonight's panel discussion. If anybody wants to respond to something that they've heard another participant say or anything like that, please go ahead and raise your hand and I will be happy to give you that opportunity. Catalyst.
Yeah, I just wanted to really back up what Barracuda was saying there as far as breathing goes. And this ties back into what Mike was saying too with martial arts. Whether it's been in my martial arts practice, in my singing practice, in my sexual practice, or my magical practice, breathing has been core to every single one of those. Controlled breathing, box breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, just really learning how your body responds to taking breaths in different ways and using specific breaths for specific purposes. And I think that's probably one of the core teachings that went through all of the paths that I studied over time. Almost every single one of them focused on breathing first. So I think that that's a really vital aspect. And of course, even in psychology today, taking between 3 to 10 deep breaths to calm yourself down and, gaining that clarity of mind. Like, we know that the way we breathe affects us physiologically and psychologically. And so, taking the teachings that come from thousands of years ago and putting that together with the science that we have of today, just they support each other in some really interesting ways in that way. So yeah, I just wanted to give that some extra emphasis there, that the way that we breathe and training our breath can be really, really helpful in any situation.
Absolutely, I agree. Comes up all the time in yoga practice and other places in my magical practice. Yeah, box breathing is a huge thing for me as well. I love it. Damien.
Yeah, I very much I second breath work, or I third breath work, I guess. For me, one of the most influential people that I was lucky enough to meet was a psychologist that I saw for some time, introduced me to the concept of mindfulness meditation in a way that sort of fit with what I needed at the time, which was through a somewhat Buddhist, New Age spiritual perspective. And like in my own experience, because I had been through dialectical behavioral therapy before and it didn't quite click for me. And what it took was hearing about mindfulness meditation from this gentleman, and then later, some years, doing the dialectical behavioral therapy course again, and realizing then that, so many of the tools that you learn, through DBT are present in, like a lot of Zen meditation and mindfulness practice and stuff like that. And it's just worded into a Western psychological or medicine perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of sort of touches on what is pathologized also, especially, like here in the West, our mental health system very much can be averse, well, or not, I guess not averse to, but like, sort of any pagan in the sense, in the definition of the word, like non-Christian or non-Abrahamic faith, is pathologized in that sense a lot of the time. And there's, there's a lot of deep roots to that. And, for me, having community as well has been a big thing, to have checks and balances in place to make sure that I am, that I guess that I'm staying within a par for, or staying within the bounds of what would be non-harmful to the people around me, myself in any significant way, stuff like that. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got Hotwing up next here.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to echo what I think everybody kind of touched on in some way or another, like this idea of, yeah, I find at least that sometimes like the practice can have this element of solitude to it that, can make the work almost more powerful, can make the results almost, more powerful. But it can also kind of lead to a certain degree of secrecy and a certain degree of, like, if it gets like bad, like, isolation and loneliness. And in that sense, like, I'm very careful about, like, what kind of things I share publicly, what kind of things I don't share publicly. But I think that's partly just my temperament. But I think it's also like important for myself to like have at least a couple of people, like close friends where I can kind of bounce these things off of. And because too much just like staying in my room and just like not talking to anyone, which is something that I have done for a lot of my life. And
all work and no play, as they say.
oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like magic for me, it's very much a pressurized vessel. Like if it gets to be to a point where there's too much building up and there's no like way to let it out, then that's when like bad stuff happens. But, just having people to just kind of like, even if it's just like people to just kind of like shoot the shit with about like, sometimes some of the stuff. I have a lot of close friends. Some of them kind of know a little bit more about, the work that I do. Some of them don't. but just being able to kind of like express some of that like can be very helpful, not just in a practical sense, but just kind of cathartic and just reminding me that and especially in a time like this, like, there realistically there's not just a stigma on, a lot of like, mental health related stuff. There is a stigma, like Damien mentioned, against people of like non-Abrahamic faiths, and especially people who do things like, practice witchcraft or certain like, religious faiths that aren't very well understood in a, just aren't very broadly well understood. So just being able to talk with people about that and kind of have people understand that in and of itself is just like really valuable in terms of taking a little bit of the pressure off.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that having a place to sort of like bounce ideas off, the notion of kind of like reality testing or whatever has come up a couple times is I think that that's very crucial. Catalyst.
Yeah, thanks. I think both Damien and Mike and I think Bearcutie as well all mentioned community and talking to people, and it brought up something for me about what a term I've learned for it is consensual reality, right? That we all have our own call it reality tunnel or call it our own perspective, viewpoint, lens, whatever, the way that we see reality, the way that we experience reality, and then there is the experience that most of us would agree is quote unquote real. And that's a word I always put in air quotes. But, as in if I walk outside and I kick that rock, it's going to hurt my toe. And if you walk outside and you kick that rock, it's probably going to hurt your toe. The rock might be illusion and your toe might be illusion and the pain might be illusion, but nonetheless, we're going to experience a very similar thing. That's consensual reality.
Yeah, we can agree on this causal relationship that seems pretty agreeable upon. Yes.
Right. Yeah. And so getting into a magical practice involves stepping outside of consensual reality. It really, it means you're no longer going to be perceiving the world the same way as everyone else does. And, there was this meme I saw go around one time, and it had like one McDonald's fry, and that was labeled crazy person. It had a small box of fries, and that was labeled cult. And then they had the big ass extra supersized box of fries, and that was labeled religion. And so consensual reality is what the biggest group of people all agree is true. And when you start looking, you start looking outside that box, and suddenly people are going to think you're crazy, even if what you're perceiving has even an objective validity that you are able to pull back and prove, which of course most of what we do ends up being very subjective. Most of our experiences are very subjective. But yeah, having a group of people around that you can talk to openly about what you're experiencing and kind of check in to see, does my experience of reality match at least some people's? There's sort of a little bit of a guideline, because if even my crazy weirdo wacky hippie magical friends are looking at me like, okay buddy, like you might want to just take a rest, then I know, okay, it's time to settle down and maybe just go swimming in the river or something. And also having to be careful, because while there are, obviously there are valid mental health issues, if I went to a psychologist and told them, yeah, I meditate, and then sometimes I hear voices telling me things that I think are true, or if I say, yeah, I had this vision of this thing happened, or there was this being in that house over there that I dealt with, like these are all symptoms of classic quote unquote mental illness. And the difference between spirituality and mental illness for a doctor or a practitioner of whatever the, psychological arts you happen to be seeing, if they don't see the world that way, that's gonna sound crazy automatically. And so that comes back to that masking comment, where, yeah, I've really had to be very conscious throughout my life of who am I talking to? Can I translate what I'm thinking and seeing into the language that they speak? So whether I'm speaking what I call psychobabble, which is like the psychological model,
Mhm.
or if I'm speaking New Age, or if I'm speaking quantum physics or metaphysics, I can whoever I'm talking to, I can usually find a way to translate it into something that makes sense in their worldview.
Yes.
And as long as I am still able to do that with people, I feel like I'm not too far off the beaten path, and I'm probably not in too much danger of going way off the deep end, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that that's a great touchstone of like, kind of your peer group who are, into the same things and share somewhat of, there's intersection perhaps in your reality tunnels more so than might be the case for like people that aren't practicing that stuff, as it relates to the questions that you might be having. Yeah, I think that that's super key for sure. I love that you brought up the idea of religion as it pertains to like what is considered pathological versus not pathological. If a religion is widely accepted, somebody can be, deeply religious and engage in practices that, if it were not attached, that religious structure would be maybe diagnosable as like obsessive compulsive or like, things along those lines. I've heard people make jokes about like, our super Catholic grandmothers only loved those rosaries so much because it allowed them to sort of like stim or whatever. Like, so there's this interesting sort of idea there that the only thing that really makes something sane versus crazy is, as you said, this kind of a consensus reality idea of that. So it's important to keep that in mind. Damien.
Yeah, I just kind of realized that I have not given my like standard issue disclaimer, which is that while magic can be very therapeutic, it is not necessarily a replacement for therapy or the kind of help that you would get from a somebody like a peer support like a peer support worker or anyone within that sort of sphere, whatever is accessible to you. Yeah, that was just kind of something that I wanted to
Sure. Yeah.
put forth.
Yeah, and I would second that too. Like, I think that that's a great thing to keep in mind. I mean, having the help of somebody who's trained to help somebody in your situation, whether or not it's a therapy thing or being trained at something, like if that's something that's accessible to you, then that's very helpful and good and
Yeah,
yeah,
I hesitate to say like mental health professional outright, because sometimes, there's a lot of times that those are
sure.
not accessible to people, but
Absolutely. Not accessible,
yeah.
or maybe if you don't find the right one, it's not always a helpful situation. There's a lot of
Oh,
nuance here, but
absolutely.
yes.
Like we were just talking about, sometimes that can be the result of people being unfairly pathologized.
Or people just not sharing enough of the context that you have for your life, and they're just not able to understand it. I've had that experience myself, and so yeah, it's complicated. But
It can be, yeah.
if we don't have any other comments, I was hoping that you all would be willing to share some final thoughts with the listeners and I, and also if there's anything that you're excited about that you would like to let us know about, there's an opportunity for that as well. Maybe we could start out with Catalyst again.
Yeah, I guess my takeaway from all of this is both magical practice and substance, psychedelic, entheogen, whatever you want to contextualize it as, can both present opportunities for healing and for harm. And a lot of the time, the difference or the factor that decides which is going to be in your life will come down to caution, I think. In my opinion, this is entirely my opinion, of course, but will come down to caution, taking small steps, experimenting, and getting deep, bit by bit, working your way into something, suspending disbelief, but also maintaining critical thinking. And that's a paradox that is difficult to resolve. Because in order for something to work magically, you have to wholeheartedly believe it, that it's going to work. I say you have to. This is my perception again. And so being able to dive into something, suspend disbelief, and really give it a proper try while also still maintaining your rational ability to reason through, to question things, and to have that sort of ability to question your own reality and that of others simultaneously, like that can be a really difficult line to walk. And don't be afraid to step back every once in a while and reassess and reintegrate. And I think that's something everyone who's talked about ADHD knows. We tend to be really good at synthesizing, taking vastly disparate pieces of information and blending them together into a whole, into a large scale picture of things. So don't forget to apply that to our own lives. And to that end, as we talked about, having community can be really, really helpful. I'm definitely finding that the Lux Occult podcast and community that has grown up around it, and the Green Machine, like these are some really amazing people and very open-minded, broad variety of skills and experiences. And so that's been really cool having that as a resource. The only other thing I'd maybe promote is globalpsychedelic.org. They call themselves it's called the Global Psychedelic Society, and the whole concept of it is find other people who are interested in exploring reality through psychedelics. If that's part of the process for you, if that's one of the paths you wish to take, don't feel like you have to do that one alone. There are other people out there. Having a trip sitter is really good, sometimes, until you've gotten your hands or really gotten your mind wrapped around a substance and you can start using it, on your own, which is incredibly powerful. But yeah, just being cautious, taking reasoned, cautious steps into things, and then backing out, taking the time to check in with your community, look around, integrate this into your worldview, and then decide, do I want to keep walking down that path, or is this a good time to switch to something else?
Oh, fuck yeah, I love that. And I'm so glad that you found the show helpful and the community and everything. And yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. Looks like we've got Hot Wing Hermit up next.
Yeah, I realized that I spoke a lot about like the risks and what can go wrong and just like ways that things go sideways. And I just wanted to kind of like just briefly just say a bit about the things that can go right and just specifically that, along with being like a potential risk and, frankly, something that can be very dangerous if it's misused. Magic, at least as I experience it, is also something that has like an immense, really difficult to measure the benefits in a positive way, in a good way, in the sense that, sometimes, like I said before, like a lot of the way that I tend to get dysregulated, I don't even know if I like that word, but, a lot of the way that happens is that I'll get so worked up, I'll just kind of be going all different directions all at once. And sometimes I'll just sit down and, maybe I'll like do something that will actually get me on point. Or, I'll kind of work with a particular, spirit or intelligence that will just kind of like sit me down themselves and just be like, hey, dude, you can stop thinking so much now. It's okay. It's okay. You can relax, and that's the thing is that like me working in my, particular type of spirit-based model is like, you come to really know or I at least, come to really know and respect and like care for, the things that know and respect and care for me.
Mm.
And there's a real sense of feeling like nurtured. And it's something where, sometimes if I need the help, I can get that help. And it's not going to be a risk. It's going to be something where it's like, I just have to know what I need to do at that particular time. And they will tell me no problem because they care about me just the same as any friend I have, any family member I have. It's a pretty beautiful thing when you experience it. So yeah, that's really cool. And as far as just things to plug, the only thing I could think, I don't have any like social media or anything like that.
Good for you.
Well, I do, but it's just accounts that I like lurk on for like, I use social media as a news aggregator. Most of my interaction honestly happens on Discord. So
Mine too, yes.
yeah, but the one thing I'm thinking of in terms of like a project is I am actually writing a novel right now. I've been writing since I was a kid, and it's part of also how I process things. There's a lot of magic in and of itself in that. And yeah, as that kind of nears a point where I kind of feel comfortable sharing it, I might start showing bits and pieces to people. So if you're interested, just hit me up on, a DM, in a
But
DM,
yeah,
whatever.
what kind of what genre is this novel a part of?
Um,
If
it's
it can be classified.
you could probably call it magical realism, but it's
Fuck
also
yeah.
got like
Alright.
all sorts of like it's complicated. I'll
Okay,
put
I
it
love
that
it. Well, thank you for sharing. Fuck yeah, thank you. Well, it looks like we've got Damien up next.
Yeah. Wow. Catalyst actually kind of like took a bunch of the words like right out of my mouth with it, especially with regards to psychedelics. The analogy that I like to use is that they are like a fire. They can give you light and warmth, or if you use them in a stupid way and play around with them, then they'll burn your fucking house down. Uh, so
Yeah, yeah.
keep that in mind. And for me, that really just comes down to checking in with yourself. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, asking yourself if you are using that substance, that entheogen, whatever it might be, to run from, a growth experience, or if you are using it to run to a growth experience, I guess. And also, making sure that your gnosis does not rely every time necessarily on being, I guess, artificially induced.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a way to do magic. It's not the way to do magic. Check in with your. It comes down, honestly, I think, to consent. What I do is I ask my body if it consents for the drug to be in it. I ask the drug if it consents to be in my body. I also do a thorough amount of Googling, of the substance beforehand,
Yeah, and we've
obviously.
talked
But
about like the idea of making sure that what you're taking is what you actually are, wanting to take versus
yes,
the adulterated things that are on the market and stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
absolutely. And like was mentioned earlier, having, a trip sitter. I don't know if it's available in the US, but in Canada, we have an app called the Brave app, and it is a secure line to a trip sitter. They don't have to talk to you or anything like that. They will just sort of be there. If you give them the red alert, then they will call a designated emergency contact. It does not have to be emergency services for you. You can, designate the instructions that you want them to do in case of a red alert and stuff like that. So yes,
Yeah, that's fucking
please
cool.
trip
Goddamn.
safely if you
Yes.
decide to do so. But yeah, no, just checking in with yourself and making sure that you are in a place for that kind of work. And if you're not, then it doesn't mean that you can't do magic. Maybe just do some healing magic, do some, protection magic for yourself, do some self-care magic, you know,
Mm.
and so that you can get to a place where you feel equipped to go into those deeper and sometimes slightly more difficult magical experiences.
Yeah, fuck yeah.
Oh, and as far as things to plug, I don't really have anything particular that I'm working on right now. You can follow me on Blue Sky. I'm Sun and Serpent .bluesky.social, and I'm going to be working on probably a fair few more magical kink classes in the coming year here. I'm just getting my own house in order before I tell other people what to do.
Right on. Fuck yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought up the idea of like that grounding thing, and this is something that I think Hot Wing had brought up earlier. This, even just doing the dishes or whatever, there's this kind of principle in a lot of traditions where when people are new to the, practice or whatever, they'll be given these kind of menial tasks, like sweeping the steps of the temple or whatever is a sort of classic touchstone here. And I do think that the reason that this is the case might have to do with that grounding that we can find in just doing those like physical everyday mundane chores. So yeah, fuck yeah.
Wax on, wax off.
Exactly. And we've got Barracuda up last but not least here.
Rad. Yeah, it's easy to go last, and then everyone says all of the things that I don't have to try to make more eloquent. I think my contribution would be don't forget to play and to feel joy and to let yourself experience things. Going down the magical track and having those paradigm shifts in reality can be really cool and really life-changing. And then we have the challenge of integrating those experiences back into that broader consensus reality and to kind of reconnect with other humans who may not be engaged in practices that put them on the same wavelengths as we might be, as we're doing different projects and magical experiments for ourselves. A side note on the psychedelics is, of course, that you can always take more, but never less. So definitely remember to pace yourself.
Yes, very wise advice there for sure.
Move forward with caution. I have been on a couple of really great nerd kinks. And so if anyone wants to talk about, it's a big ass long book called The Dawn of Everything. And it is by a couple of people named David Graeber and David Wengrow. And
oh yeah, we read this for our book club a while ago. Yeah. Revisionist history. I am here for it. There's this is yeah, we'll have to talk later about this. I don't want us to get on a whole tangent here, but it's very it kind of fucked me up when I read it in a good way.
Yeah, like looking at my succinct thing is looking at how all of these frameworks that archaeology and anthropology work from, so many of them have just come from a standard kind of Renaissance Enlightenment period philosophical thought process. And if you say, what if that's not true because we don't have any archaeological evidence for it being true, then what are some other things that we can get to imagining about the dawn of human existence and the literal tens of thousands of years that humans have had the brain that we have and the capabilities and ability to choose into life with intention that we have today. So very great nerd book. Probably a pretty similar vein would be the Adventures in Newtopia, great podcast. There's some reality tunnel stuff there. But in terms of support, especially kind of in the psychedelic realm, my partner is a counselor that works with psychedelics and does group support spaces that are low to no barrier to access. She works on a sliding scale for one-on-one stuff as well. She's going to actually do a book club that's starting sometime this week on menopause and like women's bodies or people who have menopause. Like I might have menopause. We don't even know because there's no science on it. But if you want to check that out, that's going to be with the group Weird Council. She's on Signal with weirdcouncil.40. If you want to learn more about listening to a book on menopause and chatting about it with people who have bodies that are doing that and maybe also have partners, friends, loved ones, parents, children, siblings, all of the people in your life that might have that. That'd be another space as well for future psychedelic peer support groups for anyone that might want some extra community. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, fuck yeah, I love it, and we love a book club around here.
Yeah.
and I love exploring the topic of menopause. It's not something that is I don't think it's something that a lot of popular culture really feels very comfortable with. Like the topic of the menstrual cycle in general isn't something that I mean, even the way that I said it just now expresses my own internalized discomfort, which with something which is like very normal and like just par for the course of being a human or whatever. So lots to unpack there. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate y'all so much taking the time to share your thoughts with the listeners and I and your perspectives and about your stories and everything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lexa. Thank y'all.
Yeah. Thanks, Lexa. That was great.
Thanks for this.
I'm having trouble finding my mute button, but yes, thank you, Luxa.
Fuck yeah, okay. Well, before it gets too weird, I'm gonna start recording. Alright, thanks so much to Catalyst, Hotwing Hermit, Damien, and Barracuda for joining me. And thanks also to Adsi Ipsa, Charlie, and Liliana for joining me for the first chat that we heard. It was a really fun time, and I'm hoping that people will find what we've put together here helpful in navigating the risks associated with practicing magic. It's a sort of audio love letter of sorts. Happy Valentine's Day from all of us to all of you. Please take care of yourselves and much love. You can find links to the stuff that we talked about today in the show description or the show notes. There is a link to that in the show description. If you like the show and you like what we've got going on over here, you can support it on Patreon, which will entitle you to receive a Bibliomancy break with me. Making this show is a pretty wild amount of work, especially for just one intrepid podcaster, but it means a lot to me to be able to do it, so thank you so much to the people who are making that possible by giving on Patreon or buy me a coffee, and to the people who are supporting the show by spreading the word. It's also huge, and giving it positive reviews and stuff. Tell all of your friends, allies, and magical associates about it, as well as everybody you meet at the next PTA meeting, bake sale, anarchist collective coffee clutch, or ceremonial potluck you attend. You can also post about it on social media or write a positive review where that's possible. Both of these things are super helpful, so thanks so much to everybody who is doing that. And yes, don't forget to smash the fucking shit out of that follow button or alarm or whatever it is, so you can get updates when a new episode comes out. I wanted to come back to that idea of the oldest parts of ourselves also being the youngest in many ways, the inner child or perhaps children of varying age. People sometimes talk about how for them, these more childlike aspects of the self are important actors in their artistic or spiritual practices. There's a reason that we're trained as adults to act differently than we do as children. Adults understand more about many parts of the world than children do, especially where things like day-to-day survival is concerned. The process of becoming an adult usually involves training these childlike aspects to become hidden beneath more socially acceptable ones, at least in some conceptualizations of how all this works. And thinking about and working on this stuff, though, it's been my observation that when you go to unpack one box of experiences, things can be tangled up like Christmas lights and all come out in a big jumble together. Working to untangle the Christmas lights can be a way to make them useful, a nice light source instead of some junk that you keep hidden in a box in the closet. It's a bit of a ham-fisted metaphor for sure, but hopefully it makes sense. In my experience, the childlike aspects often need healing, since as kids we don't really have the ability to process all the things we might need to process, and stuff can just sort of like build up. It's like a bunch of tangled Christmas lights, as I said. All this can make these more childlike aspects potentially problematic or risky to approach, but they're also the oldest and are wise about things that the more adult aspects of self have perhaps forgotten or discarded. As I mentioned earlier, for some people these childlike parts of the self are also very magically and artistically important, which I suppose might also be seen as another type of potential risk or potential reward when it comes to magic or perhaps art where mental health is concerned. As we discussed today, so much of it comes down to understanding context and nuance. Some questions I like to entertain in my daily life, and which I will leave you with to ponder while I share the Green Mushroom Project statement of resistance with you all, involve the following. In what ways can you safely honor the younger parts of the self? What are they asking for that you might be denying them, even if it would hurt nothing or no one to give them what they want? And what are some small and gentle ways you might be able to give them more of a voice? While you think about this, I will remind you to resist. Resist by maintaining sovereignty of the self. Resist by maintaining love of the self. Resist by maintaining fierce loyalty to love and pleasure. Resist with acts of radical kindness. Focus on the path to better times. Fuck yeah. Thanks so much to all of the amazing practitioners which I have impaneled for today's discussions. Adsi Ipsa, Charlie, Liliana, Catalyst, Hotwing Hermit, Damien, and Barracutie. Gratitude for all the kind words of support and everything that you all have been giving the show. Appreciate it. Lots of cool stuff on the horizon. I appreciate the help from both seen and unseen sources. Gratitude Void and Hel Hecate. And most of all, thanks so much to you for listening. Much love. This is Lux Estrada, reminding you to stay strong and stay fucking curious. Don't forget to guard your mind. Cheers.
Be excellent to each other and party on.
Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.